Todd Brewster is our guest. He's the author of a New York Times bestseller, and his new book out is called Lincoln's Gamble, the tumultuous 6 months that gave America the Emancipation Proclamation and changed the course of the Civil War. Todd Brewster, welcome to Big 550 KTRS here in St. Louis.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be on your show.
You got it. All right, so take me through this, because the Civil War was already going on, and in the middle of the Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation is proclaimed, and many historians say that changed the reason for this Civil War. Take us through this.
Well, in the the states secede from the Union at the moment that Lincoln is elected president, and so there's signs that conflict is on the way. Lincoln has pledged that he is not interested in disturbing slavery where it exists, only in seeing that it doesn't extend to the Western territories. This isn't enough for the South, which anticipates an attack upon their peculiar institution, as it is often called. The war begins. Lincoln raises the mission of the war as exclusively one of preserving the Union, bringing the rebellious states back into the Union, which frustrates the abolitionists, frustrates many members of his own Republican Party who believe that slavery is the core issue and that slavery should be addressed. Lincoln resisted over and over and over again until these 6 months that are the focus of my book, Lincoln's Gamble, which begins really July 1862, at the moment when Lincoln first introduces the idea that he's going to issue an Emancipation Proclamation, to the date January 1, 1863, when he actually signs it into law. And in those 6 months, we see a real hinge moment, not only in the war. The war shifts from being almost exclusively about the restoration of the Union to be about the restoration of the Union and the end of slavery. It also is a hinge moment for the country in that the government, the federal government, becomes primary and supreme, and becomes a shift from, as they often say, before the Civil War, the country was a plural. The United States was a plural noun, and afterwards was a singular noun. And then it's a hinge moment for Lincoln himself, who goes through a deep spiritual crisis, a constitutional crisis, is of two minds about the decision to emancipate the slaves, goes back and forth, writes 3 different drafts of it, changes it, denies it, reintroduces it, pulls it back, and finally signs it on the 1st of January.
One of the reasons for the Emancipation Proclamation was that Great Britain was going to join the South if Lincoln did not make it a moral cause and try and outlaw slavery.
Well, you retained a lot. That's absolutely true. Actually, not so much join the South as recognize the South. It's a very interesting issue that coming up again in the news now. I mean, what makes a war? Lincoln preferred to believe that he was at war with a rebellious element of Southern states, not that he was at war with the Confederate States of America, which they claimed as a separate country. So, we're going over the definition of war right now with respect to our attack on ISIS in the Middle East. What constitutes a war? What constitutes a state? And during the time of the Civil War, Lincoln was very eager that foreign nations not recognize the Confederacy because that would give them a legitimacy that he didn't believe they deserved and would undermine the North's effort to defeat them.
So again, the separatists in Syria and the freedom fighters in Syria, if we recognize them, then that brings them legitimacy, so to speak. So if Britain would have recognized the South, that would have legitimized them more or less.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
And so, where was that in his plan? I mean, was that a major reason? Was that one of the reasons?
I think it was one of the reasons. Now, for the North in the summer of 1862, they just had this miserable Peninsula campaign in which General George McClellan, who was the general whom Lincoln clashed with so repeatedly in the early years of the war, had mounted an utter failure in the Peninsula campaign. So the war was going poorly. They needed a change of strategy, a change of tactics. There was also, as you say, the issue about foreign recognition, which Secretary of State Seward brought up prominently in conversations with the president. about the urgency for resisting that. There was third the sense among many that the time had come to shift the mission from purely saving the Union to one of saving the Union and ending slavery. Lincoln would have argued, I believe, at the time that they were not only not inconsistent with each other, they were actually part and parcel with each other. The American idea, the original American idea, originating with the Declaration of Independence, would have denied slavery, and that we were adjusting ourselves back to that with the abolition of slavery, and therefore that the war was still about union, about restoring the principles of the founding. Of course, the South felt they were restoring the principles of the founding when they withdrew and resisted the federal government.
The book is called Lincoln's Gamble. Todd Brewster is our guest, ABC News senior producer. Has written a New York Times bestselling book with Peter Jennings, and his new book is out, Lincoln's Gamble. It's amazing, Todd, that we still argue today over the reason for the Civil War. Yes. So I'm going to ask you, and I've sort of answered it this way. People say it wasn't about slavery, it was about states' rights. Well, it was the rights for the states to keep slavery versus the rights of the states to say, hey, these men and women aren't property, they're actually people, and therefore no other people can own them. It sounds like, from what you're saying, it started out. Well, answer the question. I mean,
I think it was all the above. Yeah. I really do, and I think that's why it continues to gnaw at us. What was the real reason for that? I mean, we still see arguments now, frankly, over. I mean, it's a consistent argument day in and day out as to the power of the federal government over the rights of the states. We see this in the courts. We see this in our politics. We see this in our popular culture. So it's part of the American argument, that persistent argument that we have with ourselves about how to create these balances. We pride ourselves on a system of government that is a balance of power, checks and balances, and we find ourselves readjusting that all the time. So I think it was about states' rights in one aspect. It was also about slavery. I mean, a country founded on liberty can't very well exist with the practice of slavery within its limits. So there was something that was persistently inconsistent with the American idea that slavery was tolerated. I think the founders knew that when they authored the Constitution. They knew that they were setting the country up for a crisis down the road, and the crisis happened in the middle of the 19th century. And I would say that, that war also still continues to be fought. If you look at what happens in response to my my Facebook page or Twitter, people writing all the time saying the South should have won. Surprising the persistence of the Confederate States even in the 21st century. Lincoln's
Gamble is the name of the book. Todd Brewster, our guest. So, knowing enough to be dangerous, if the South would have agreed to say, hey, you know what? Okay, look, no more slavery in the new states, but, guarantee us slavery in the existing states, that would have been good enough for Lincoln?
It would have been, and that's one of the interesting things about the way the war unfolded and about these 6 months that I articulate here. Lincoln believed in a gradual and compensated end to slavery. In fact, in 1858, when he's arguing in the famous debates with Stephen Douglas there in Illinois, he says he expects that the ultimate extinction of slavery would have taken 100 years or more. So he is arguing at the beginning of the war that slavery does not need to end in the states where it exists, and believes that there can be a peaceful solution to this, argued out over time. It's interesting to think that if the South had accepted the offers that came from Lincoln, even right up to the beginning of the writing of the Emancipation Proclamation, and we can go over that in some of the drafts that Lincoln wrote in the first one he published, which was in September 1862, which offered, an opportunity for this. Agreed to a gradual, no time limit on it. Gradual, compensated means they're being paid to end the practice of slavery. End to slavery, phasing out over a time that that he would have been satisfied with that and ended the war.
So you're saying that the federal government would have paid slaves for their
paid slave owners for their loss of property.
Right. Yeah. So they would have bought the freedom of the slaves, yes, more or less.
Yes.
And the South said, sorry, not gonna happen.
Right.
Yeah. What would have happened if the Emancipation Proclamation was never written, never signed?
Well, it's interesting. These are one of those counterintuitive things you don't know. I
Right.
mean, we can't, the what ifs of history, I think it's tantalizing to think about it because one of the points or the themes of my book is that the Emancipation Proclamation was never really a certainty, even right up to the day before it was signed. It was almost an accident of history that it happened, and that it happened when it did. I believe that most people had a sense that slavery was certainly on its way out, that it would have gone whether there had been an Emancipation Proclamation or not. Even Secretary of State Seward believed that the moment that the first shot was fired at Fort Sumter, that the end of slavery was going to be the result of this war. I believe that it's hard to imagine when Lincoln says a 100-year phase-out of slavery, that means it would have taken it to the 1950s, the day of Elvis Presley and Eisenhower, Brown versus the Board of Education, Little Rock, all those incredible moments of the American Civil Rights Movement. He's imagining that slavery would have existed up until the time when we associate with so much bigger advances for our race relations.
Except that, you had the Civil Rights Act signed in 1964, and you had the Voting Rights Act signed in 1964. So it almost did take 100 years before a lot of that stuff was...
Well, that's another way of arguing it, certainly. And one of the things you can certainly look at with respect to the ending of slavery is that it did not mean the establishment of equality.
Right.
In fact, Lincoln didn't believe in equality of the races. He certainly believed in an end to slavery, but the end of slavery, the abolition of slavery, was not equated with him with the introduction of equality.
Yeah. So the Emancipation Proclamation happens, and did it land with a dud? Was it front page news? Was it on all the cable shows that night?
It's important to remember that. So he introduces the idea on a carriage ride to the funeral of a young infant, the son of Secretary of War Edwin Stanton. Just to two of his cabinet members, says that he's going to do this. He doesn't want any arguments. He just wanted them to know. A couple of weeks later, he introduces and reads the first draft to the assembled cabinet. They urge him to wait to issue it to a moment of strength rather than the dark position that the Union Army was in the middle of the summer of 1862. That moment arrives for Lincoln with the Battle of Antietam on September 22nd, 1862, and he publishes the Emancipation Proclamation right after that battle. It's greeted with great enthusiasm. Lincoln has finally established that he wants to free the slaves, except then people begin reading the fine print and discover that it's much more complicated than that. And then there's certain opposition to it. He loses some favor in the midterm elections, going right up to the moment when January 1, 1863, when he signs it. So it's a back and forth battle. I mean, as late as August 1862, he's inviting black leaders to the White House, urging them to lead a movement out of the country to colonize black Americans back to Africa or to South America, to Panama. He denies that an Emancipation Proclamation would be any benefit when he meets with a group of ministers in early September 1862 who are chastising him for not being more forthright on the issue of slavery. He says, what would be the point of my issuing an Emancipation Proclamation? I can't even free the slaves in the states where they're being held because they're in rebellion against the country, and that's one of the side stories of the proclamation, the effect it could have. So anyways, back to your question, by the time he signs it, there's been a great deal of back and forth and discussion and hand-wringing over whether this is going to have any effect upon the war. He is freeing the slaves in the places where he does not have control and leaving slavery intact in the border states and in the north where he does have control. So the question is, what kind of impact could that have? Well, two things happened. One, it brought a new kind of brutality to the war. The war at that point had been fought army against army. Lincoln, with the Emancipation Proclamation, was introducing a war against civil society, really introducing a war against the property of the South, the institutions of the South, the very character of the South. This is what we call total war, the kind of thing that was characteristic of 20th century warfare. Lincoln had changed the terms of the war, and he was severely criticized by the South for doing that. They argued he was not fighting in the tradition of Christian civilization. The other thing that was very key, though, in the final version of the Emancipation Proclamation, the one he signed, was that he encouraged the freed slaves to enlist in the Union Army, and they did in wide numbers. 180 to 200,000 members of the Union Army in the last years of the war are black Americans, most of them freed slaves, and they play a big, big role in defeating the South as we near the end of the war.
So much more to get to. That's why you've written the book. Todd Brewster, our guest. The book is called Lincoln's Gamble, The Tumultuous 6 Months That Gave America the Emancipation Proclamation and Changed the Course of the Civil War. Todd Brewster, great work. Thanks for checking in. Good luck with the book. Have a good day.
Thank you so much. And if anyone wants to learn more, my website is lincolnsgamble.com. I appreciate all your time.
lincolnsgamble.com. Thanks. Have a good day, Todd.
Bye-bye.
Todd Brewster, Lincoln's Gamble, the name of the book. 9:24 here, Big 550.